Hey everybody, welcome to Film History Lesson number 5. This week we are talking about color in film, and you may be familiar with the fact that color has existed in film as far back as Edison's days, but we're talking about a little bit more of a refined process. That said, it's not color film. We're talking about like this dye transfer process. We'll get all into that a little bit later in this discussion, but I need to clarify just a little bit of something with Technicolor. So Technicolor is a company. It's a company that was founded in 1916, but it's also a process. So there's a 2-strip Technicolor process and a 3-strip Technicolor process. This is the way that we get color onto our film so we can see color. So there may be some easy confusion. Technicolor the company, Technicolor the process. Either way, you're accurate if you call it Technicolor. So if our goal is to evaluate color in film, we might need some kind of basic vocabulary associated with color in general. And you may be familiar with this stuff if you've taken an art class in high school or in college. But if you haven't, some general things to kind of know about when you want to talk about specifics with color. So primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. If you look at a color wheel, this should make sense to you. Red, yellow, blue, primary colors, and then purple and orange and green are all secondary colors. Mixes of the primary colors will get you secondary colors, and then there are tertiary colors like red orange or yellow green. So mixes of a primary and secondary color will give you a tertiary color, and it all kind of exists on a spectrum called the color wheel, and you can use these different types of colors in a color palette. So we see these with films all the time. The amber and teal color palette is like a trope that you see in most like action movies today or contemporary action movies, or even any of the big blockbusters. You'll probably see amber and teal, and it's basically, blue and orange. And sometimes you see skin tones that are way oversaturated to give you this kind of complementary color palette. So if you have two colors that are on the opposite sides of the color wheel, so if you have blue and orange on the other side, the orange will really pop off of the blue background. So if you have an orange subject and a blue background, we're really going to look at that orange subject. Likewise, green and red do the same thing, but we have this kind of connotative feelings about red and green, and that's just like the Christmas season. So you see red and green decorations everywhere. You can't avoid it, even if you don't celebrate Christmas. You see red and green around December time, and you associate that with a specific thing. So blue and orange, very, very common because the sky is always blue and skin tones are, close to orange, I guess. They can be close to orange with some digital color correction. And you'll almost always see a blue sky in a film. Now, there's also a monochromatic color palette that you may have seen in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari if you looked at the color version. So that just means one color, monochromatic. And that's often mixed up with black and white. So black and white has no color, right? So it's a desaturated image. No color exists in it. But monochromatic means one color. So there's just one color. So if you've seen some scenes from like The Matrix, they have a monochromatic color palette. It's just like green or just blue in the shot. You may have warm and cool images. Cool colors are just on one side of that color wheel. So greens and blues and purples are cool. And warm colors are on the other side of the color wheel. So orange and red and yellow, all of those things are warm colors. Saturation just means the intensity of color. So if you have a very bright, vibrant, neon-looking pink, that is a high saturation pink. And if we turn down the saturation, it'll become less vibrant. And if you turn down the saturation all the way, it'll become gray. So any image that has no saturation is just black and white. And black and white doesn't necessarily mean black and white, but black, white, in a spectrum of gray in between. So there are tints and shades, and tint means a hue, a color, plus white. So if you're adding color to white, you get a tint. If you're adding color to black, you get a shade, or you can add black to a color to get a shade, right? So there's a difference, though, when it comes to film. So a tint kind of refers to us adding a color to a black and white image to give that black and white image color. And it's usually like a monochromatic color palette, and it's something done kind of in post-production. So it could be added to the actual film stock, or it could be added digitally. That's a tint when we talk about film. And we'll talk about additive and subtractive colors when we talk about the 3-strip Technicolor process. So if we think back to the very first week of class and a trip to the moon, you may have looked at an alternate link than the one I provided you and watched A Trip to the Moon in color. Now, Trip to the Moon in color is one of two things, right? There is a digital colorized version floating out there on YouTube where like someone with some visual effects experience went through and painted with a computer each and every frame to provide color to something that was previously black and white. But there is also like a Criterion version of A Trip to the Moon where like in the 1900s, someone went through and painted each and every frame with a little paintbrush, and probably looked through a magnifying glass to do so. So very, very small paintings. And if you saw that version, you probably saw this very rudimentary color on film. And there were similar things done all the way back in the Edison era. And then there's like color tinting, which you may have seen if you looked at an alternate version of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In various versions of that, there's like blue tints to some of the footage there. So color in film has been around for decades by the 1930s, but the only two real processes for colorizing film is either rotoscoping, which means every individual frame of any single print needs to be painted by hand, which is very difficult to do, or color tinting, where like the entire image gets tinted in one tone, right? So you could have blue or purple, but you know, like everything is blue or purple. You can't have individual elements unless you sit there and rotoscope it. So not very lifelike, and also very difficult to reproduce. So there were two companies that were trying to change that. That was Eastman Kodak. You remember them from the first flexible film, and then Technicolor. And both were using a beam splitter to split color that was received by the camera into different color channels. So if you've ever seen like a prism and a light shined at the prism, and then it displays a spectrum of color like a rainbow against the wall, very similar to that, only it's just two colors. So the red channel and green channel of color is captured by two separate film strips, and then those film strips are combined to give you both red colors and green colors in the image. So this looks a little bit more realistic, more lifelike than the rotoscoping or color tinting, but there's still, you know, at least one other color that we generally think of that needs to mix together to get those more lifelike colors. So from the late 1910s to the late 1920s, the two-strip Technicolor process and then the two-strip Eastman Kodak process were of some interest to people. That doesn't mean that they're at their height of popularity. Color existed during this time, but not for too many productions. So after the 1920s, public interest in the two-strip process had pretty much waned. It was kind of seen as a gimmick and had no intrinsic value in film. So people just went to see black and white films again. Now, Eastman Kodak had plenty of things to do other than color film, but Technicolor, a company founded completely on the premise of providing color to film, had to do something a little bit different. And in response to this, they developed their 3-strip Technicolor process. And even though the 3-strip Technicolor process is no longer used today, it's very outdated, some of the foundational elements, the additive and subtractive color processes, exist today in every monitor that you look at and every print that you look at. Anything that's printed by computer uses a subtractive process. So as you build up inks, your ink gets darker, right? You may have done like an art school project like that before, right? You pour in some red ink and green ink and blue ink and all the colors, and what do you get? Probably some really dark gray color, maybe even black, depending on the balance of colors that you threw in there. Now, if we look at a monitor, and you may not have had a class on monitors before, if you take red, green, and blue colors at full power in a single pixel, what you end up with is a white. So that's an additive process. The more color you add to a single pixel, the brighter it becomes. So depending on whether you're looking at something that's like light, an additive process, or something that is like ink, a subtractive process, both are kind of operating under these principles that the 3-strip Technicolor process established. And that is the 3 colors that are foundational to both additive and subtractive processes. So red, green, and blue, you may be familiar with this from a monitor. A monitor has red, green, and blue colors natively in them. And then every other color is just a mix of red, green, and blue. There are some monitors out there that have like a gimmick yellow. I don't know if that's still popular today, but a few years ago, that was kind of introduced since, we're reaching our threshold with resolution. So why not introduce an extra color? I don't think it's super popular, but red, green, and blue has been around since the old CRT and tube television days. Now, the subtractive colors are cyan, magenta, yellow, and then, black as well. So black is part of it. But cyan is kind of like a teal color, magenta is kind of a pink color, and yellow, well, you know what yellow is, right? So the idea is they need to translate red, green, and blue to cyan, magenta, yellow, and they do it through this kind of dye transfer process. So once again, we have a prism splitting the image into separate color channels. This time, though, it's separating it into 3 different color channels: red, green, and blue. Now, each of these color channels are once again recorded on their own strip of film. Then each of these strips of film are dyed their complementary subtractive version of color. So red, green, and blue become cyan, magenta, and yellow. So the overall strip is dyed cyan, the overall strip is dyed magenta, and the overall strip is dyed yellow. Each of these strips are then printed onto their own strip along with a black and white strip to provide some contrast to the image. And there you have it. You have color in film. So this is the most lifelike, realistic color we've had so far in history. That said, it's not exactly perfect. Images are a little bit oversaturated generally. And it's a very difficult process, right? Like just describing it took some time, but each of those film strips needing to be recorded separately and then printed, very time consuming, very costly. The cameras that were used to capture 3 strips all at the same time were massive and loud. And eventually the 3-strip Technicolor process would be blown away by Eastman Color. So Eastman Kodak came out with its own color film stock. So no prisms, no special cameras, nothing like that. You could just film in color, which was cheaper and easier to do than the 3-strip process. So eventually people moved over in that direction. But what is really interesting is it wouldn't be until the 1940s when Eastman Color kind of took over. Eastman Color was around in the 1930s. So people stuck with the 3-strip process despite its cost, despite its difficulties, because there were some really influential people behind Technicolor that really helped influence how color exists in film. So certainly one of the reasons why the 3-strip Technicolor process outlived its expiration date was Natalie Kalmus. So Natalie Kalmus was one of the founders of the Technicolor company and was integral in both the 2-strip and 3-strip processes. It's a little bit unclear how much she actually contributed to the scientific elements there, but she is given some credit. And you'll see her name in the credits as color director for almost every Technicolor production in the golden age of Hollywood. And color director isn't like a role that exists anymore, but at the time it was fairly important. And Kalmus is incredibly interesting. So she published a book about the psychological effects of color, and a lot of what we associate with colors could be directly attributable to Kalmus. So colors and their meanings and what we get out of them. There's been a lot of like psychological studies about these things, and it's unclear whether these things are like natural in us or kind of learned. And if it is kind of learned, it would be learned through media and a similarity in storytelling language and color language. So if that's the case, Kalmus may be responsible, or at least partially responsible, for how you associate colors with different psychological factors. Now, on set, Kalmus would have a lot of friction with a lot of filmmakers. Sometimes she worked well with them, sometimes not so much. So David O. Selznick, the director of Gone with the Wind, one of the films that you have the option to watch this week, they didn't see eye to eye with a lot of things. Kalmus was very insistent on some muted colors and then just using vibrant colors to kind of accent things. She thought that a restrained color palette made a lot of sense for this particular film. And Selznick maybe had different ideas scene to scene, so they kind of butted heads there. And also, Natalie Kalmus and her relationship with her husband would kind of not dissolve Technicolor. Technicolor is still around today, but not at the same level it was in the 1930s. But when she filed for divorce from Herbert, she attempted to like split the company in half. She lost that lawsuit and stuff, and then Technicolor moved on to attempting to create like 3D images and stuff. So they very much shifted their focus away from like color theory, which was probably what was keeping Technicolor afloat. So the 3-strip process didn't have a super long lifespan, but it did have a great legacy. So it's kind of like the Vitaphone from the sound lesson. So the Vitaphone, very bulky, very cumbersome, difficult to work with, but provided synchronous sound in a real way for the first time, and that was huge for audiences. And because of that, all of these adaptations were made to make it easier to produce films in that way. The same goes for the 3-strip Technicolor process. People saw a vibrant color film that was realistic for the very first time, and therefore we have color in film as a standard today. So you have 2 films that you have to choose from this week to watch. You don't have to watch both. You can just choose either or. I would suggest that you watch one that maybe you haven't seen before. So maybe you've seen Wizard of Oz before, but you haven't seen Gone with the Wind, or vice versa. Both films use the 3-strip Technicolor process. Both films were overseen by Natalie Kalmus. One, she had a bit of a clash with the director, and the other, she had pretty much free reign to do what she wanted in terms of color. Now, rather than just limit you to talking about color in these films, I will ask that you at least touch on color in these films, but I understand that there's a lot of interest in additional elements from both of these films. So a whole lot of people like to talk about the controversies surrounding The Wizard of Oz and their production tactics and the injuries and the illnesses. And that's okay. If you want to research that stuff and you want to include that in your blog and make that your main point of focus, that's fine with me. In Gone with the Wind, you also have some controversies. Their depiction of the South during the Civil War and some characters that are pretty much just racist caricatures. It's not overtly racist like we saw with Birth of a Nation, but there are some moments that are certainly troublesome, to say the least. And if you want to talk about either of those things with either of these films, that's just fine. Even if you want to make it the main point of focus, I have no problem with that. But I do want you to at least touch on the color in the film. This is something that's completely new. So like think about think about Gold Diggers of 1933. We're looking at films that are just a couple of years ahead of that. So you see major advances in terms of sound quality, but you see this significant shift, right, in terms of aesthetics. So all of a sudden, where there was no color, now there is. So watch the films. Both are available on HBO Max if you have an HBO Max subscription, and they're available all over the place on the internet, but they are not in the public domain, so I can't link you to them in the YouTube description. So you'll be on your own once again to find these films and watch them. That is the way it's going to be for the rest of the semester. Everything will be on HBO Max if you have that subscription though. All right, so that's it. Do your blogs, get them in before Monday, and I will see you all next week with another film history lesson.